I wanted to put a plug in for this book by Robert Bowman, Understanding Jehovah's Witnesses, Why They Read the Bible the Way They Do. Robert Bowman was not a witness, but he is a scholar, and I like his focus. Here's the focus from the blurb on the back of the book. The focus of this book is on understanding Jehovah's Witnesses, not attacking them. And the blurb goes on, in fact, writes Robert Bowman, understanding Jehovah's Witnesses is equally for members of the church on the corner and their neighbors at the Kingdom Hall down the street. This book provides evangelicals with an overview of the beliefs of Jehovah's Witnesses, a faith and high view of Scripture one should respect. The author asserts that Jehovah's Witnesses are often blindly attacked under the guise of evangelism. He shows how to speak the truth in love to a Jehovah's Witness. This book invites Jehovah's Witnesses to take another look at the Jesus Christ of the Bible. Why is he so central to the faith of evangelical Christians? How did fellow believers in Scripture get so far away from one another in their conceptions of God? It's a very kind approach, and I've always enjoyed Bowman's presentations. It's a phenomenon that deserves observation, that oftentimes evangelicals are much kinder to witnesses and more understanding of them than ex-witnesses can be. So, of course, are they ex-witnesses not just informed better than evangelicals can be, but at the same time they often have a tank of bitterness that, of course, Bowman and other evangelicals don't have. This book is very helpful. I wanted to give you a sample from it. This is from page 97, chapter 7, a case study in Watchtower interpretation, Luke 23:43. So if you know that text, and it's one of our favorite proof texts when it comes to paradise earth, where Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." Some of you will be familiar with the opposite interpretations taken by evangelicals and Jehovah's Witnesses. Here's a segment where Bowman focuses on the word paradise itself, because after all, this is the only time that Jesus is ever quoted as using that word. Bowman says, the word paradise in biblical times had a varied history. In the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament used by Greek-speaking Jews in the 1st century, the word referred to the Garden of Eden, as well as to a future transformation of Israel's land to resemble the Garden of Eden. Notice that neither of those applications are the Watchtower's application. One is about the earth, yes, and one is about the Garden of Eden that's long gone, but neither of them is about the entire earth. It's Israel's land, for instance, in Ezekiel 36, verse 35. Bowman goes on, however, in 1st century A.D. Judaism, paradise referred primarily to a hidden place of blessedness for the righteous between the time of their death and the future resurrection. This is the usage reflected in Jesus' reference to paradise in Luke 23:43. To show that this was not the Jewish understanding in Jesus' day, the Jehovah's Witnesses quote the New International Dictionary of New Testament Theology. And here's the quote they use. With the infiltration of the Greek doctrine of the immortality of the soul, paradise becomes the dwelling place of the righteous during the intermediate state. So they acknowledge that this idea of paradise had been transformed in over a few hundred years since most of the Old Testament was written. Bowman says, however, in context, this reference work is saying that the idea of an intermediate paradise for the dead developed in Judaism after the Old Testament period and was the Jewish view in Jesus' day. It goes on to state, quote, in Luke 23:43, that is the word paradise, is no doubt dependent on contemporary Jewish conceptions and refers to the at present hidden and intermediate abode of the righteous. Now, if you want more information on that, you can look into Josephus, which is available in, of course, downloadable form, being public domain. Josephus on Hades. What did Hades mean to the Jews of that day? Bowman goes on, in at least 3 different discussions of Luke 23:43, the Jehovah's Witnesses cite James Hastings' Dictionary of the Bible to prove that there is little support for the theory that first century Judaism conceived of an intermediate paradise. What Hastings actually says is this, quote, "It is certain that the belief in a lower paradise prevailed among the Jews, as well as the belief in an upper or heavenly paradise." So Hastings is acknowledging that the lower paradise, the idea that there's a paradise for the righteous in Hades, prevailed among the Jews at that time. On the same page, he also states regarding Luke 23:43 that Christ referred to the paradise of heaven. These 2 examples of misuse of biblical scholarship illustrate my 6th point. This is well into the chapter, by the way. That's why he says this is the 6th point. Jehovah's Witnesses often cite scholarly sources selectively and out of context, usually to support a conclusion opposite to that supported by the source. It is one thing to show that a scholarly source provides evidence for one's position, despite its reaching a different conclusion. That is legitimate, but that is not what the Jehovah's Witnesses have done. Rather, they have quoted from the scholarly work in a way designed to give the misleading impression that the source reaches the same conclusion as they do. This happens all too often in Watchtower publications. Many evangelical publications, including some by this author, have documented examples of this kind of error, so I will not belabor the point here with additional examples. The only other places in the New Testament the word paradise occurs are Revelation 2:7 and 2 Corinthians 12:4, and both are instructive. The Jehovah's Witnesses themselves state that the paradise of God, in Revelation 2:7, is a heavenly paradise, although they do not recognize it as an intermediate state for the dead between their death and resurrection. 2 Corinthians 12:4 is even more interesting. The parallel between paradise and the third heaven indicates that paradise here is a heavenly realm, as nearly all biblical scholars commenting on the passage have recognized. Indeed, paradise was said to be in the third heaven in Jewish literature circulating in the 1st century. So, the commentaries, yes, do tend to agree that this is what Paul means here. The third heaven is equated with paradise. That's the current Jewish understanding. It's not based on the Old Testament. The Jehovah's Witnesses, however, have argued that Paul was referring to a spiritual state among God's people during the time of the harvest season, which would come just prior to the end, this idea of spiritual paradise with which we're all familiar. In other words, they claim that Paul had a vision of the Jehovah's Witnesses of today. Of the many objections to this interpretation, we may mention just 2. Nothing in the context of 2 Corinthians 12 hints that paradise is the people of God in the last days. And if paradise there means God's people, then so does the third heaven, which is absurd. The Jehovah's Witnesses' handling of 2 Corinthians 12:4 illustrates a 7th observation. Jehovah's Witnesses frequently allegorize prophecies and visions in Scripture to make them refer to events in the history of the Jehovah's Witnesses, always with no basis in the text itself. A study of the Jehovah's Witnesses' recent commentary on Revelation will provide many illustrations of this interpretive abuse of Scripture. And of course, that's the big red book with which we're all so familiar, which is apparently also out of print now. This is being written in the 1990s, by the way. So, that's part of his treatment of the case study in Watchtower interpretation, Luke 23:43, starting on page 97 of his book, which I strongly recommend for Jehovah's Witnesses and people leaving Jehovah's Witnesses. Jehovah's Witnesses, why they read the Bible the way they do. So we're going to put this book in the basic playlist, the basic library of Jehovah's Witnesses playlist. I'll put in a link to William Vine's discussion of Hades and what it meant in the days of the apostles. William Vine, of course, which diligent Jehovah's Witnesses are familiar with his name, Vine's Expository Dictionary of New Testament Words. So what did this expert have to say about Hades, hell, and the afterlife in the New Testament period? And also the playlist, which we have on hell, Hades, and the afterlife on your screen. See you soon.